Richard Dawkins. I remember reading his book, The Blind Watchmaker.
Yes.
And reading it, and I can almost quote it verbatim, evolution, the blind automatic mechanism that Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and the development of all of life. And it took a very long time for him to realize that the first part of that statement is false.
Yes.
That's right. You just heard Alex O'Connor, the well-known online atheist, agree with Christian apologist and genius mathematician John Lennox that the argument that Richard Dawkins makes in The Blind Watchmaker is totally false.
The first part of that statement is false.
Yes.
Now, this will come as no surprise to any Christian who's done any research on the subject, but there are still many atheists and others out there in the culture who believe that science has disproven God. Not only will I show you today that science is not actually in conflict with Christian faith, but also the more we find out, the more we have reason to believe. Now, we'll jump into that. Before I do that, I want to welcome you to the show. My name is Reed Uberman. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Today on the show, I'm going to try to provide Christian commentary to cultural events because I believe we're living in an age of bad ideas, and the only cure for bad ideas are good ideas, and the best ideas are found in God's Word. Now, before I jump into the rest of the show, also want to make sure that you know that today's show is sponsored by our friends over at Sweet and Savory. The online or in-person cooking class experience could not have gotten any better for you and your family because now they are offering summer camps. So you might be wondering to yourself, what do I do with my kids? They're driving me nuts and I love them dearly, but they do need something to preoccupy their time this summer while they're out of school. And why not give them the opportunity to develop some life skills in the kitchen? They're eventually going to have to learn how to feed themselves and survive on their own. So why not help them while they're young figure out how to make some of the most amazing meals? And they can do that by going to our friends over at sweetandsavoryclassroom.com, where you can find date night experiences, online experiences, in-person cooking class experiences, and of course, their summer camps for kids. So all you need to do is go to sweetandsavoryclassroom.com, scan through all the list of the classes that they have, and then before you check out, make sure you type in the promo code IndieThinker for a discount on your order. Now, when The Blind Watchmaker was originally written by famous atheist Richard Dawkins, many thought that it was the final nail in the coffin for belief in God. Nietzsche was right, and we don't need anyone to wash the blood off of our hands. We'll be just fine. Now, as we are reeling from a postmodern liberal society and we recognize that faith in God actually was good for society, and we're clawing back some of the damage that was done by the new atheists, we shouldn't forget that in its time, The Blind Watchmaker was a potent argument for atheists. And it's supposed that because of things like natural selection, evolution more broadly, that there isn't a need for a spiritual designer. And in fact, there isn't evidence enough to support the idea that there is a designer in creation. Now, Richard Dawkins argued two things: that all we need to account for the existence of life and the development of life is found in the blind watchmaker argument. Unfortunately, he was totally wrong. And Alex O'Connor and John Lennox show this in a recent conversation they had.
Now, Richard Dawkins, as you know, who's a brilliant writer, I must say, I remember reading his book, The Blind Watchmaker.
Yes.
And what arrested me in reading it, and I can almost quote it verbatim, so that's a compliment to Richard, that evolution, the blind automatic mechanism that Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and the development of all of life.
He said that.
Yes, it's in the book.
Yeah.
And it took a very long time for him to realize that the first part of that statement is false.
Yes.
For a very simple reason. Because evolution, again, whatever it does or doesn't do, depends on the existence of life to do anything. So it cannot be the explanation for life.
Now, because I think this is so important, I don't want you to miss what you just heard. Alex O'Connor and John Lennox agree. The blind watchmaker argument is fallacious because it in no way accounts for how life began to exist in the first place. There's no accounting for that in evolution whatsoever. But there's also one other thing that we should say about this argument, and it's probably one of the more important things. And that is that even if Richard Dawkins was totally right about both claims, that it would in no way deny the fact that an immaterial mind could be responsible for the creation of the universe and the creation of life. Now, it might mean that that creator looks a little bit different than we suspect, but it in no way denies that a creator could exist. In fact, the idea that a blind watchmaker exists in the first place kind of lends credibility to the idea that there is something going on beyond just pure naturalistic evolution. And that's what I want to try to argue in this show. Because beyond your community college professors' arguments and beyond your high school science teachers' arguments, you should have a lot of skepticism about the second claim of the blind watchmaker argument, that we can account for the development of life purely from evolutionary processes. Now, in order to set the stage for this, I want to show you an article from Live Science because they just recently found, supposedly, a stone with a marking from 43,000 years ago. So here's the story. A red dot on a face-shaped rock in Spain may be setting records in more ways than one. At roughly 43,000 years old, the dot may be the oldest human fingerprint on record and also one of the earliest symbolic objects ever found in Europe. The fingerprint made with red mineral ochre was left by a Neanderthal, the closest extinct relative of modern humans. Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago, but occupied Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before early modern humans arrived on the continent. The researchers behind a new study argue that the red dot represents a nose on a rock with face-like features. The discovery is a further challenge to the idea that Neanderthals were generally not capable of symbolic art. But some experts told Live Science they are not convinced that the dot is symbolic. Anthropologist and archaeologist Bruce Hardy of Kenyon College in Ohio, who was not involved in the discovery, said that the red dot was definitely deliberate, but little more could be certain beyond that. Well, I don't think he protests too much because actually suggesting that just because you found a red dot on a rock that a Neanderthal put it there actually is not supported by the evidence whatsoever. So the reason I bring this up is that you should have a high level of scrutiny whenever you read anything like this. Here's why. First of all, it doesn't really make sense that that red dot has existed for 43,000 years. Now, second of all, Neanderthal, and I'm going to use this word specifically, even if it causes the atheist to run to the comment section. But Neanderthal mythology is predicated upon over-extrapolation on a very small set of data points. So in this particular case, the fact that this is a fingerprint on a rock automatically assumes that it was a Neanderthal based upon the dating of the rock. I mean, let's just say that you should be pretty skeptical about that claim. And then you should also know that multiple fakes over the years should draw a large level of skepticism whenever you hear anything about Neanderthal man, especially when it's predicated upon such scant evidence as what you just heard. Now, let me give you the background for this. The existence of a million fakes should never deny the presence of the real thing. Atheists try to argue this all the time when it comes to Christianity. Well, what about what Christians did in the Crusades? I don't care if there were 10 billion Christians who did evil things in the past. It doesn't deny the fact that Jesus existed and that he may be who he says he is. And that's the more important claim to try to uncover rather than whether or not Christians can be hypocrites, because surprise, they can be.
You sure?
And I will also say that I'm going to venture outside of my realm of expertise. I am not a scientist. I'm not a biologist, but I at least have enough common sense to know that some of the claims, the linchpin arguments that evolutionists make to say that God doesn't exist really shouldn't be made from a logical perspective. And here's why. So fossil hoaxes come in two kinds. First, they come in the form of fraud, and then they come in the form of human error. So fraud would be things like Piltdown Man, which is one of the most famous evolutionary frauds of all time. Piltdown Man, of course, was a discovery that was groundbreaking for over 40 years in the scientific community. It showcased a skull from a Neanderthal man, but there's just one big problem with it. The skull was from a man, and the person who created this hoax shoved an orangutan jaw with chimpanzee teeth on this human skull and then tried to pass it off as some kind of transitionary or common ancestor to modern man. Now, that was finally exposed, and it made atheists have to undo all of their writing for over 40 years. But then there's another kind, the kind of hoax that I still think could be a hoax because it can be misleading evidence based upon an ideological purpose. So this one would be something like Nebraska Man, where a tooth was found that supposedly was tens of thousands of years old and showed that Neanderthal man actually existed. But there's one small problem. Upon further discovery, it was found that the tooth was just from a wild pig and not actually from a human being. Now, we could go on, and I could talk to you about Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, and I could tell you that only 20% of her bones were actually found, and that her skull was completely crushed in, and that the generated images based upon the skull are completely a fabrication. And I could go on and tell you that DNA evidence from any of these things is scant. But let me give you one last kind of example of this. And this comes by virtue of a relatively recent discovery, and one that is one of the most important. This is Alcimura Man in a cave in Italy. And I think the cave was something like Lama Lunga Cave. So this skeleton was found in this cave, and it was supposedly from a very, very, very ancient time and is definitive proof that Neanderthal man existed. But there's some reason that you should have caution over this discovery. Here's a couple of the reasons why. First and foremost, the skeleton is embedded in the rock, and therefore they were not able to extract any of it. So that means that they are taking a small sample size in order to try to extract the DNA. Not to mention 99% of DNA is found in soft tissue and not in bone. And because of the old age, all of that DNA is completely degraded. So there's also this other thing. In order to date this skeleton, they couldn't actually test the skeleton because it's so old and brittle. So they had to test the calcite around and on the skeleton. And I hope I don't have to tell you that that is an incredibly flawed method, not only because calcite can appear older than it actually is, but also the calcite that's already existing in the cave could form on top of the bone, making it look much older than it actually is. And then maybe one last argument will help create a sense of skepticism, or at least hold off judgment too quickly. And that is that any of the formations of this skull that make it look like a supposed Neanderthal skull could easily be chalked up to pure deformities. Now, I could add more to this. I could talk to you about the fact that genetic similarities don't necessarily constitute that there is a common ancestor by virtue of natural selection. And in fact, that it even could suggest a common creator as opposed to a common ancestor. I could go on to show you that fossil records shows zero evidence of the kind of time and transitions necessary for the species to exist that we now have. And the Cambrian explosion actually kind of proves that life can be created in a very, very short amount of time. Third, the probability of mutations creating intelligent life as we have it today is incredibly flawed. Let's just say that the degradation of a species doesn't necessarily create the perfection of a species.
But the people are retarded.
And fourth, and most importantly, molecular biology continues to push us away from the idea that life is simple and a blind watchmaker could have made it, and to the conclusion that it is sophisticated enough to impose the idea that an intelligent designer is behind it all. So let me at least just say this, that there is no evidence that the atheist has provided up to this point in time that an immaterial mind isn't necessary to create the universe and to create life, or that an immaterial mind doesn't exist. And I'll go one step further. The more we discover, the closer we are pushed to the idea that we are created and that there is a creator. Now, to really finally seal the nail in the coffin of new atheism and the idea that evolution proves that we don't need God, I want to introduce you to my friend, Joe Rogan.
The difference between science and religion is that science only asks you for one miracle. I want you to believe in one miracle, the Big Bang.
Yeah. That's a good one.
It's a great line.
Yeah.
It's because it really is true.
Yes.
And it's funny because people would be incredulous about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but yet they're convinced that the entire universe was smaller than the head of a pin, and for no reason that anybody's adequately explained to me that makes sense.
Yeah. No.
Instantaneously became everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't buy that.
I'm sticking with Jesus on
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah.
Like, Jesus makes more sense.
Now, Joe Rogan is right and he's wrong. Now, he's right about the fact that he's sticking with Jesus. I'm sticking with Jesus, and you should stick with Jesus too. But he's wrong about this. Atheists and evolutionists, scientific naturalists, whatever you want to call yourself, you require way more than one miracle. Even if I were to grant you that the Big Bang could come about through naturalistic means, through non-theistic reasons, then you are still going to have to explain things like how in the world a fine-tuned universe came about by an accidental explosion. You are going to have to explain how life came from non-life, how vertebrates came from non-vertebrates, how meaning-seeking human beings came from a mindless mechanical process. In other words, from flux. So how does it come to be that there are human beings with a conscience that are seeking things like the meaning of life and the purpose of life and doing all of that, these very moral activities from chemical soup? See, you need a lot more than one miracle, but the reverse is actually true. You only need one miracle for Christianity. If Jesus was resurrected from the dead, then you have every reason to believe that everything he said is true. His claims to be God are true, and he is worthy of your faith. So when you dig into the evidence and you're honest with where the evidence actually leads, I think you're left with one conclusion.
Say Christ is Lord. Say Christ is Lord.
That's my conclusion, and even if you're not a Christian, I hope you'll give it a fair hearing. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if this show was beneficial to you. You will love becoming a member over at indiethinker.org/support, where you can deepen your Christian worldview through movies, ebooks, documentaries, and so much more. Don't forget to check out the sponsors down below in the description of this podcast, but most importantly, go with God.